And we're live. Hey everybody, well there's a couple of us here. One, I apologize for last night. Something unexpected came up and I was unable to contact you guys and let you know I couldn't join and obviously join the meeting. So here we are, the few of us that are able to. It's being recorded for those that are not. Let me get a couple of things out of the way before we get into the lecture meeting. We have a chance to learn a bit more exam. For exam 1, it's available now. It's due September 12th. The exam will contain 5 short answer questions randomly selected from Unit 1 and the lecture essay, Race, Class, and Slavery. Right, so how this works is, again, this is an optional assignment. You don't have to do it. It's just a way to improve your grade and to learn a little bit more about the topic in case you were a little bit rushed when you were preparing. But basically, if you earn an 85% or higher on this exam, 20% extra credit will be applied to your Unit 1 exam. So what you should do to prepare is what you've been told and advised to do to prepare is to make sure that you have thorough responses for each short answer question from the study guide, and to make sure that all 3 learning objectives are responded to for the lecture, Race, Class, and Slavery, thoroughly, abiding by the guidelines. And again, you want to strive to draft a 5 to 8 paragraph essay when you take it. So that's available there for you. Let me know if you have any questions about that. I'm going to move on to the assignment for today's lecture meeting, which is also optional. It's also extra credit. But either turn on your mic if you have a question about this assignment or get me in the chat box. But we're going to go down to week 3. Going into lecture 3, salutary neglect. Scrolling down. And for today's meeting, there's an extra credit assignment referring to points made during this lecture meeting and specific examples from the lecture. Respond to the following questions. And I'll talk about those in a second, depending on the quality of your response. So really take note of this. Depending on the quality of your response, up to 5% extra credit will be applied to the Unit 2 exam. So it doesn't mean you necessarily get the 5% if you complete this, although it's very possible. You just have to respond in 2 complete paragraphs to these questions. And then we will get into these questions in a little bit when we talk about the lecture. How does the concept of salutary neglect explain the origins of the conflict that ensued between Great Britain and its colonies? And how does the concept of salutary neglect explain the origins of state rights? Why is this important to understand? So we'll get into that in just a little bit when we get into this lecture here. But to begin with, anybody have any questions whatsoever? All right. A couple other things too. When it comes to the discussion posts, the students that are earning closer to 80 to 90% are people that are responding thoroughly to the prompts by providing specific examples from the assigned reading. They're not just giving general responses about the colonists or Great Britain, but they're giving examples from the assigned reading. Also, with the I can really tell when a student has taken the time to view some of the videos that are posted throughout there as well. And you want to do that for your actual post and the student reply post. So remember the point of the discussion post. It is to basically create a virtual study session for everybody. And again, use that to your advantage, but always confirm. Somebody can get on there and post anything. You don't know what kind of grade they're getting. So what you want to do is to take your notes and then to go through the discussion posts and see if there's things, additional items that you can add. And then when it comes to the exams, again, same thing. You really want to provide examples. You want to adhere to the guidelines. If you're finding yourself only writing 1 to 2 sentences for the short answers, that's probably an indication that you could provide more specific examples from the assigned readings when you're drafting your notes. Any questions before we begin? Let me know. Either turn on your mic or just chime in on the chat box there. But in this lecture meeting, we're going to go over some broad strokes. The details are listed in the notes and in the pre-recorded videos for the lecture. So I'm going to go over this because this is a lecture, really you get lost within the weeds if you don't understand the point of this lecture. And the point of this lecture is what this extra credit is getting at right here. So we will talk about what salutary neglect is in just a second here, but understand that when you have an understanding of what salutary neglect was historically, you're going to understand exactly why there was conflict between Great Britain and its colonies. And you'll understand why the timing of when that conflict began, 1763, is significant, right? And then you also want to understand why salutary neglect explains the origins of the concept of states' rights. And again, we'll get into that in just a little bit. But to begin with, and this is part of Learning Objective 1, here is the definition of salutary neglect. And again, please interject with any questions or comments, either by turning on your mic or going into the chat box. Okay, here's the definition. Salutary neglect is the time period between 1607 and the founding of Jamestown, Virginia, to 1763, where the colonies developed as an unintentionally, virtually, now take note of that word right there, unintentionally, virtually independent states, acknowledging allegiance to whatever authority of England, right? So in other words, if you ask somebody living in the colonial period what they thought about England, they would say, I'm a proud subject, right? But they made their own laws and traded with whomever they pleased, defending themselves without the help of Great Britain. And again, the key word here is it's unintentional, right? This is something that kind of grew organically, mainly due to the state in which Great Britain was in when it first began to colonize. It was not an organized, sophisticated nation state. It had a lot of internal conflicts, and it was way behind relative to Spain or Portugal. And to a lesser degree, France and the Netherlands. To flush out this definition here, it's important to understand that there were three phases of salutary neglect, right? So there's this phase right here, basically no imperial policy whatsoever, right? But mercantilistic trade was beginning to gain force, right? So what this is dealing with here, this phase here is basically, again, remember, England is Johnny-come-lately to this game of empire. And it is doing these Hail Marys in order to establish colonies. And in doing so, besides the proximity, right, it's far away, these colonies, they don't have the ability, the state power, to enforce any kind of imperial creed or standard on its colonies. And as a result, what is going to happen is that the colonies are going to develop unintentionally independent from Great Britain. Not only are they going to develop independent from Great Britain virtually, they're also developing independent from each other, right? Take note of that. That's an important point, right? So by the time we get to 1763, you basically have 13 independent states that begin to some degree slowly beginning to have conflict with Great Britain, and that ultimately from 1763 to 1776, that is going to lead ultimately to independence and then the war with Great Britain to defend that independence. All right, phase two. 1796 to 1763, England, and then after 1707, the Kingdom of Great Britain tried to form a coherent policy mainly with the Navigation Acts, right? And basically, to summarize what the Navigation Acts were, they were basically a series of laws that try to enforce mercantilism, right? Does anyone have an idea? All right, take note of this. This is real important to understand mercantilism, right? Real simple too. It's not a huge concept to understand. Basically, mercantilism is the economy of empire. Mercantilism is the economy of empire. And what do empires do is they have colonies. And why do they have colonies? They have colonies to exploit natural and human resources. And so the point of a colony is to extract the wealth that's developed from those resources. So for example, Jamestown produced tobacco, right? And so the planters baled that tobacco up and sent that tobacco to England. And then in England, it was transformed into a consumable product, right? So from those big bales of leaves, it is turned into some sort of smoking tobacco or cigars. And the goal of a mercantilistic economy within an empire is to solely rely on the colonies for trade. So you are not dependent in any way to rival nation states. So mercantilism, very simple, is the economy of empire. They're using their colonies to produce these primary products like tobacco, indigo, rice. It is sent over to the mother country, Great Britain in this case, turned into a consumable product, and then traded within England or Great Britain, and then sent back to the colonies also to be consumed and purchased, right? And so again, the goal here is to make sure that trade is contained within the empire and there isn't a trade deficit, or in other words, they are to become dependent on Spain or Portugal or France or Denmark or whatever the case may be. So that's what mercantilism and what the Navigation Acts was an attempt to begin to enforce mercantilism. So basically, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, New York, New Hampshire, whatever colony we're talking about, that's fine if you want to trade with France or Spain or Portugal. But if you're going to do that, you need to basically get authorization from a magistrate in England and use English ships to transport your product, right? It was a way of trying to control trade and enforce mercantilism. Now, keep in mind, for the most part, these laws are not going to be enforced, the Navigation Acts, as well as the Trade Acts as well, which were under the same line as what the Navigation Acts were, which was an attempt to enforce mercantilism. But what's significant about that is beginning in 1696, when the Navigation Acts are being passed, it's an indication that Parliament and the Crown of Great Britain was beginning to try to gain some control over its colonies. And part 3 of Salutary Neglect is basically Great Britain trying to enforce its imperial rule over its colonies, which will ultimately fail with the American Revolutionary War. Anyone there understand why 1763 this begins to change? So just to recap, from 1607 to 1763, Salutary Neglect is basically Great Britain unintentionally ignoring its colonies as far as governing it is concerned. People in the colonies are making money, and to some degree the empire is benefiting from it through trade, but not to the extent that, say, France, Spain, or Portugal were benefiting from its colonies in the form of tax bases and all of that kind of stuff, right? But what happens in 1763 that is going to alter this relationship that developed? chime in whenever you can. And let me try to explain salutary neglect too in the way like a family sometimes plays out between children and their parents, right? So let's say if some parents, they have some kids, and these parents are very relaxed with their kids as far as rules are concerned, right? From the ages of 0 up until they're a teenager, right? There's no real bedtime. They can sleep over wherever they want. They can play out as much as they want. They're able to do whatever they want in the house. There's really no order within the home. And then all of a sudden, around 14, as a person does, they begin to go through puberty. And essentially what puberty is really defining who you are as a person, right? You begin to have your own interests, your own likes. You know what you like, you know what you don't like, you know who you like to hang out with, you know who you don't like to hang out with, right? That process begins 13, 14, 15 years old. And this is where sometimes you begin to have conflict because with parents, because parents will look at you and go, that's not who you were. Why are you changing? This is the way I would want you to be. Well, if you've been raised in a relaxed household and all of a sudden you are coming home really late at night, 11, 12, and maybe you're out doing things that are illegal, and your parents are beginning to get concerned. So much to the extent that the parents say, you know what, we are going to have to change things up in this house, and we are going to start enforcing some rules here. You're going to be home by 9 p.m. on Friday and Saturday nights. You're not going to hang out with those friends that are getting you in trouble anymore. You're going to start having to do chores around this house. Based on that scenario, anybody chime in, please, here. How do you think things are going to go in that house from 14 years old till whenever that child decides to move out when he's about 18, 19? As he becomes or she becomes an adult. How do you think things are going to go in that household? Okay, if nobody's there, I'm going to take off. It's got to be a two-way street. There will be tension, right? And anybody can turn on your mic too. So if you're taking too much time to type, that's fine. Yes, there'll be tension, right? Probably more than tension. There will probably be fights and screaming. Who knows what will happen, right? I mean, it'll be Crazyville in that household. So what the parents should have done if they wanted to have more control and a more sane household for the teenagers is they needed to enforce and articulate rules and customs within the family early on, right? And so what salutary neglect is you can extrapolate this family metaphor to how the colonies were raised with Great Britain, right? And in 1763 is when things begin to change, right? So, and you could say this is when the colonies are fully independent and they have a sense of who they are, and the rules are going to change. This is when Great Britain is going to begin to bring its imperial power to its colonies and begin passing laws and, more important, enforcing those laws. What happened in 1763? Why did it all of a sudden change? Hint, you might want to take a look at the learning objectives. They give you somewhat of a clue. Particularly learning objective 4. So just looking at the prompts itself might give you a clue to what began to change. well, I'm going to take off if people ain't prepared or willing to at least make a mistake or hang out. I'm just talking to a screen. Hello. It's okay if you're wrong, or if we need to kind of flush it out. I need some participation, though. Yes. What began to change? Why all of a sudden? So salutary neglect is the unintentional, basically neglect of its colonies from 1607 to 1763. That's going to begin to change. What happened in 1763 to precipitate that change? Well, okay, gained land in the north, yeah. Back, that's part of it, but how did that happen? A little bit of land in the north. What happened, though, in 1763? Again, there's a hint within the prompt of learning objective 4 for this lecture. Yes, Carla. Excellent. Treaty of Paris. And so treaty, there obviously was a war. What was this Treaty of Paris trying to reconcile? What war? Yes, French-Indian War, sometimes referred to as the 7 Years' War. So, and basically the French-Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, was a war between Great Britain and France. And what it was basically trying to do was to see who was going to lead the world going forward as far as colonies in the Americas are concerned. And the end result of the French-Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, is Great Britain is going to win. Now, here's where the relationship between its colonies and Great Britain is going to change. Up until then, England was very much consumed with trying to focus on its internal politics and external politics. And one of those external politics was always dealing with the consistent threat coming from France. Now that they have won the war, they don't have to worry about the French anymore. So by virtue of that alone, they are able to begin to focus on their colonies. The other thing, and even more important, is that wars cost a lot of money, right? And now that the war is over, they've got to figure out a way to pay the debt that is incurred as a result of that war. And so they realized that their colonies were an untapped source of potential revenue as far as taxes are concerned. And so they began, for the first time in the history of the colonies, going back to 1607 all the way to 1763, by imposing taxes on the colonies to help pay for the war. Right? What issue do you think, though, the colonists are going to have with this, with paying taxes? What's the issue for them? Oh, they got plenty of money, the colonists. There's wealth to be taxed there. So Great Britain needs to tax them. Colonists have money, and they're going to tax them. And the taxes actually, what they're talking about, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, these taxes were always modest taxes. So what do you think the issue was for the colonists beginning in 1763, when this relationship begins to change, all the way up to 1776, when independence is declared? Why do you think the colonists took issue with these taxes? Was the issue that they raised the amount? I'm not sure exactly what you're saying there. Again, the taxes were modest. There's a very famous phrase that comes out of the American Revolution that gets to the heart of why many of the colonists who joined first the revolt against Great Britain and ultimately the independence movement. It gets at the heart of where this conflict emerged. And the guy's name was Patrick Henry, who uttered a phrase that I know you guys are all familiar with. You've heard it before. He said something about no taxation.
Is it without representation or something like that?
That's it, yes. And what does that mean exactly?
Would it be like they needed a lawyer?
No.
Sure.
So we have to pay taxes, right?
Yeah.
And where do the laws come for us to have to pay taxes?
The government.
Specifically, where in the government? Which part of our government creates laws?
I went blank. I remember.
So we have legislators, right? We have lawmakers in Congress, right? And state assemblies. So in Austin, there's a state assembly. And if there's taxes that need to be generated, whether we're talking about property taxes here in the state or income taxes at the federal level, lawmakers get together, they write a bill that's either sent to the governor, is as far as Texas is concerned, a state is concerned, or it's sent to the president and signed into law, right? We have representation, right? And so if we find that the taxes are too high or seem to be excessive, or it's just another tax that we don't want to pay or don't see the need to pay it, you can call your representative, you can call your senator, you can write them, you can organize against them, and you can, come election time, choose to support a different politician who might be running to help maybe change the tax policies. So getting back to the question, Patrick Henry, no taxation without representation. What do you think he's getting at there? For the colonists, why do you think they're upset about these taxes? Based on Patrick Henry's famous phrase of no taxation without representation. The colonists had a government. They had their own governments. All right, so where do you think these tax laws are being passed? Like the Sugar Act or the Stamp Act? Where are these laws being passed? Yes, it's taxation from England, but they understand it's not necessarily that they have to pay taxes. So let's focus, Valerie, on this concept of no taxation without representation. I want to make sure people understand that. What was Patrick Henry talking about when he said that? He's not saying no taxes. He's saying no taxation without representation. What does he mean by that? What is he talking about when it comes to representation? Was that just a They didn't have any say in government policies. Yes, all right, that's what it's getting at. And what did Patrick Henry mean by no taxation without representation? Why didn't they have any say in those policies? What does it sound like Patrick Henry wanted? Patrick Henry is saying, hey, taxes, I get it. Stuff doesn't grow on trees. Yes, right? For the people to have a say in who they elected, right? And so again, where do you think these laws are being passed at? Like the Stamp Act, which is going to raise taxes on paper goods, mainly stamps, legal documents. Where did that law come from? Parliament, yes, in Great Britain. And so Patrick Henry wants representation where? As a colonist. Where does he want to be represented? Well, no, these laws aren't being passed in America or in the colonies, Great Britain's colonies. So if Patrick Henry, in order to satisfy Patrick Henry, he's up for paying taxes, but where would he want to have representatives? Where are these laws being passed again? In the Parliament. Excellent, right? So the colonists, when they begin to get upset post 1763, based on this war that has happened, and Great Britain is trying to dig itself out of this hole by passing laws that are intended to generate revenue, in other words, taxes. People like Patrick Henry, or Sam Adams, or John Adams, or Thomas Jefferson, or George Washington are saying, listen, we get it, but how about the colonies have actual representatives within Parliament who could debate these laws, who could vote for these laws or against these laws? And that way, we will have a government worth supporting, and we will have an investment in these laws, right? We will be obliged to these laws because we do have representation. They don't have that, right? These laws are just being imposed. From the perception of Great Britain, the colonists are just that. They're colonists, and they're supposed to be subservient to the empire. And that, in a way, they have a point there. That's the whole point of an empire, to have colonies. You have colonies, and you're supposed to have subjects there that abide by imperial creed. But this is where salutary neglect comes into effect here. Because from 1607 all the way to 1763, to a large degree, depending on the colony we're talking about, these colonies governed themselves. So they weren't a lawless place. They weren't unaccustomed to taxes. They had representation within their colonial governments. And if they didn't like the people who were running the government within the colonies that were taxing them, they could vote them out to the degree of which people could vote back then. Usually it's going to be a white male with a substantial amount of wealth and property. But they are going to become concerned because these laws are going to get passed post 1763 are going to come top down against them, right? So this is learning objective 1. Again, the definition: salutary neglect is the time period between 1607 where the colonies developed as unintentionally virtually independent states, acknowledging allegiance to whatever authority of England, but made their own laws and traded with whomever they pleased, defending themselves without help from government, right? That's all going to change again post 1763. So that's what salutary neglect, the history of salutary neglect is, and why it ended. So let's get into a little bit of the details here of looking at how this all came about, right? And there's lots of ways that we can look at this as far as the colonies being founded and developing, but the Puritans offer us, and the colonies that develop from the Puritans offer us the starkest example of the effects of salutary neglect. And so it's important to understand why we're looking at the Puritans in the context of this conversation, salutary neglect. So who were these people? These people were people who were disenchanted and distrustful of what this guy created. Right here, this is King Henry, who wanted to divorce his wife because she wasn't giving him any sons, but the popes denied him his basically annulment, his request for a divorce. And so he said, screw it, I'm King of England, I'll create my own church. And so he creates the Anglican Church in 1527. It's a Protestant church with him as the head of the church. So he is the Papa or the Pope of this church. And basically what this new Protestant church was just a tool for this guy and future kings and queens to better govern the colonies, right? He could care less about the theology and the virtue and the truth claims of whatever the church was. He was in it for power, and this was just a mechanism of power. But there were lots of people who at first were very excited about the split from the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was an institution of state power that held together most of Western Europe. From the fall of the Roman Empire up until beginning, their power begins to wane after the Protestant Reformation of 1517. So it's beginning to wane. The Catholic Church, like any institution, had become corrupted by its own wealth, the power that it held, right? And the followers of Christianity became disillusioned with this church, right? Basically, the Catholic Church, from their perception, had lost its way. And so the Anglican Church presented at least an opportunity for things to change. But basically, it was a carbon copy of the Catholic Church. It became corrupt just as much as the Catholic Church and really wasn't pose any problems. And so who these Puritans were basically true believers in Christianity and wanted to further develop the Anglican Church in the way that Martin Luther, basically the guy from Germany who kicks off the Protestant Reformation in 1517, was employing, which was that you can develop a personal relationship with God himself. You don't need a conduit through the church or a priest or a bishop to develop that relationship and to communicate with God, right? It's just, those are just helpful tools. And so this is what Puritanism was about, right? And so this was seen as a derogatory term towards these dissidents of the Anglican Church. They were basically seen as just these Puritans who wanted to purify everything, right? And so people looked down on them and thought they were these kind of zealot type creatures who were taking things a little bit too far. So the Puritans and were, again, true believers and were committed to their relationship with Jesus Christ and God, and wanted the institutions that they worshiped at to reflect that. Why is it important to understand these Puritans within the context of salutary neglect? Well, these people are accustomed to challenging state authority, right? They don't mind following state authority, but if the state seems to be developing policies that are either just illogical and don't abide by any kind of virtues or morals, they're going to at least question them, right? And more than that, they're going to take action based on their propensity to question, right? And so out of this Puritan movement, you're going to have three different types, and I don't have to get into the details are in the lecture, but you have the Presbyterians, which is more of a centralized form of a religion, like they have a central church. You have the Congregationalists, which basically is developing independent churches from each other. And then you have the people that we are familiar with, the Separatists. And these are the pilgrims that come over on the Mayflower. These people they don't believe in reform. They don't think that the Anglican Church can be fixed, and they want nothing to do with it, right? And so these people are willing to leave Great Britain and kind of start anew. Important to note that these are followers of John Calvin. It's just kind of an aside, just to give you an idea of who these people were. John Calvin was an early Protestant minister who believed in the concept of predestination, which is basically that it's not about if you do good works or not as a human living on this planet. God already has predestined you to heaven or hell. And so, yes, it's good to be a good person. It's good to do good works while you're here, but don't think that's going to get you into heaven or keep you out of hell. You know, God is merciful, but he has a plan. And if that plan doesn't involve you, well, that's just tough luck, right? And so these people are followers of that, right? And so not too pertinent to our conversation here, but to understand who these people were, this is where they're kind of descending from. The formative years of salutary neglect. Again, these separatists are first going to go to get away from the Anglican Church. They're going to go to the Netherlands in 1608 from 1609, which is going to be short-lived. There's rumors that Spain is going to invade the Netherlands, and also the children of these separatists are fast adopting the Dutch culture of the Netherlands. And so they want to make sure that their children are growing up in the way they intended. And so by the time we get to 1620, an opportunity develops for these people, commissioned by Great Britain for these people to colonize the Americas. And so they're going to head over to where they thought was going to be the Chesapeake Bay. And anyone who got into this lecture, so they're heading towards where there's already a colony. So right here, again, from the last lecture, Jamestown exists. And so they are basically getting commissioned by these people to come out here and to participate in business in the developing fishery there. And in some ways, these people are going to be not so much indentured servants, but part of their profits that they would make would be going towards basically the House of Burgesses. So that was the intention. They're going to end up not landing here, but landing in Massachusetts, right up here. So pretty far away. Right? That's the equivalent of pretty much traveling all the way from South Texas all the way up to almost the very top north of Texas, right? Far, far away. Does anyone know why they ended up here instead of going down here where they intended to go? A storm knocked them off course, right? So they're intending to go here. Storm knocks them off course, and they end up landing up here in Plymouth. This is important to understand within the context of salutary neglect because it begins to set up a pattern. One, these people don't know where they're at. The Puritans are landed here. And more importantly, the people down here have no idea what happened to them at first. And the people in Parliament in Great Britain have no idea what was happening. So when they get to Plymouth, which is what they're going to name this area Plymouth, they're going to realize this, right? That, okay, we have no government. We have no ability to take care of ourselves. We have to develop our own infrastructure here and kind of make do of this. And so they're going to come up with the famous Mayflower Compact, which is going to have elections, right? It's going to provide for a government that is local, right? And so this is a stark example of the beginning of salutary neglect. They are out of necessity creating their own government that's going to be localized for the intention of establishing this colony and this community that they're hoping will become entrenched. And very much it's going to work very well for them, right? It's going to work a lot. It's going to be a lot more successful for these people than it was for the original colonists in Jamestown, because these people are working together. They are a community of Christians. It's not necessarily that because they're Christians. This is their community, and they have a communal goal through their belief system and their truth claims from their religion. And so they're not going to be individualistic. It's not going to be this dog-eat-dog world. They are going to thrive within this environment based on the cooperation at first that they're going to be giving each other, right? So understanding basically that, who these people were, they are these people who, again, had a problem with the state religion, the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, as it's sometimes called, because they didn't think it really was a church that was adhering to Christian doctrine, and it was just basically a cynical tool for the king to impose his own power. So they're used to questioning it, and again, they're used to taking action on questioning that. Now, where this becomes significant is, again, this is this part of the world right here, Boston and going to develop into Boston, Massachusetts. Keep that in mind. Real quick, when you think of the American Revolution, as far as right before the war itself, where is most of the action happening in the 1770s? Where are most of the protests happening? Where are most of the riots happening? The organization of it happening? Let me ask this. What's the most famous event you can think of leading towards the American Revolution? The most famous protest of the revolt period leading to the American Revolution? Had to do with tea.
Was it when they threw the tea out of the ship or something like that?
Yeah. Boston Tea Party. Excellent. Right. And where did that happen? Just to reiterate.
I'm guessing Boston.
Boston, Massachusetts. Now, so that's in that is in 1773, right? So we're talking about, what are we talking about? 150 years after the Mayflower Compact, and these colonies have developed and established themselves. I point that out because if you think about the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Massacre, the Sons of Liberty, people like Samuel Adams, John Adams, again and again, now it's coming out of Massachusetts and particularly Boston. All of the events didn't come out of that area, but many of them did, and that's not a coincidence. It comes from this culture that develops most starkly out of Plymouth and then later Massachusetts, of, again, coming from these types of people who are not only willing to question state authority, but take action against state authority, right? And so by the time we get to the 1770s, you have generations of people who have been accustomed to, when the state begins to impose its power in a way that just doesn't make sense, and it's for power's sake, you have a culture of people there that are willing and able to question and do something about it, right? Like the Boston Tea Party. Okay, so moving on, this is dealing more with some of the later learning objectives and dealing with the ability of, or the desire of Great Britain to try to control its colonies. But in the end, underscoring the power of salutary neglect, right, and how it was played out. So Massachusetts is well, let me skip over here. Yeah, the founding of Massachusetts, it happens in 1629, right? It was attempted to be revoked in 1635, but that's going to fail. And then so from 1635 all the way up to 1686, basically or Massachusetts, as salutary neglect basically attempts to explain, is governing itself, right, with very little input coming from Great Britain, right? So by then you have the Trade Acts have been passed. It's not too long before the Navigation Acts are going to be passed, but for the most case, Great Britain or Massachusetts, Plymouth, all of these colonies here, they're basically governing themselves, right? And particularly within Massachusetts. This is the attempt for this is going to begin to change with the so-called Dominion of New England from 1686 to 1689. And so in the context of this conversation of salutary neglect, what is important to understand about this event here is that it's going to underscore the culture of independence that developed under this unintentional regime of salutary neglect. And so what the Dominion of New England was the attempt of Great Britain to create one large colony, right? And this actually will give us a better map of this right here. So if you look at this map here, the intention was to create all of this area right here into one colony, the Dominion of New England right there. So all of New England, New York, and New Jersey would be under this new colony, right? And it would be led by a guy named Sir Edmund Andros. And basically the intention here was just to consolidate power, right? To take all of these different governments that had developed, these colonial governments that had developed in the colonies, and to get them under one authority, the government of the Dominion of New England, which would answer straight to Great Britain, Parliament, and the Crown. And it's being led again by Sir Edmund Andros. I think we got a picture of him coming up here. No, okay. And again, the intention was to make government more efficient and to enforce the Navigation Acts. Again, the acts that were designed to enforce mercantilism. It's going to make a long story short, the Dominion of New England is going to utterly fail. It's not going to work, right? First and foremost, it has a lot to do with the type of leadership. This guy right here, he goes in with this kind of iron fist and arrests people that disagree with them, shuts down schools, shuts down newspapers, and is really trying to enforce British law on this place, right? And what he fails to appreciate is that if you think about from the founding of Massachusetts in 1629 to 1686, we're talking about 50 years here. These people were used to governing themselves. And so possibly the Dominion of New England could have succeeded if this guy was a little bit more patient and sensitive to the 50-year culture that had developed in Massachusetts, right? The other reason why it's going to fail is that there's going to be a civil war that develops in Great Britain called the Glorious Revolution. And so this is going to preoccupy policy decisions in Parliament and the Crown. And so they are just basically going to say to the Dominion of New England, screw this, we'll deal with our colonies later. And so it reaffirms this concept of salutary neglect. It reaffirms this culture of independence that has developed in each of these colonies to some degree, some more than others. Like Georgia and the Carolinas were a little bit more controlled than someplace like Massachusetts, but there was still a degree of salutary neglect in all of the colonies. And so this further confirms that, right? If the Dominion of New England had succeeded, the idea was to, let me go back to this map here, was to also create a dominion, right? And so if we were to play what if history here, if the Dominion of New England had succeeded, there would have been not 13 colonies, but 2 colonies. And if they had succeeded, this is a big what if, perhaps this momentum of salutary neglect, which was only 50, 60 years old, could have been greatly diminished, and perhaps there might not have been in 1776 this move toward independence, the revolution, the war itself, and so on and so forth, and the idea of the United States of America as a country. Okay. So getting on to learning objective 4, moving along here. Again, I'm just going through broad strokes to make sure that when you guys get into the details of the lecture through the notes and the provided videos, that you don't get kind of lost. I want to make sure you understand what this concept is of salutary neglect. So getting back to what we originally talked about in the beginning of this lecture, of why salutary neglect is going to begin to essentially end, right? French-Indian War creates the end of it creates a time and a need to spend time in its colonies. The time comes as a result of that Great Britain wins against France and also Spain. And so they're not dealing with the external threat of France and to a lesser degree Spain by 1763 as a result of this war. And so now they have the time to focus on their colonies. The need comes, again, the war cost a lot of money. And so there's a need to generate revenue through taxes to pay for that war. And so they're going to begin to impose taxes on the colonies. And from the perspective of the colonist, it's, hey, we don't mind paying taxes. We understand canals cost money, navies cost money, trade policies, that all cost money. But we would like some representation. We have been governing ourselves, after all, for going back to the early 1600s. And so to evoke that parent-teenage conflict again, right? A parent is not going to have an easy time of it if they begin to get strict when the child is 13, 14 years old. And this is essentially what Great Britain is going to do. They are all of a sudden going to become strict when for nearly 150 years prior, they were not seen whatsoever in many cases. Now, to go back to the extra credit assignment that's available here, let's see if we could, based on these kind of broad strokes we were going through, begin to answer these questions here. How does the concept of salutary neglect explain the origins of the conflict that ensued between Great Britain and its colonies? So based on what we've said, how do we respond to this question? So again, the conflict ensues in what year? What years does the conflict between the colonies and Great Britain begin to emerge? 1763. Excellent, right? As a result of what? Just to reiterate it, make sure we understand what this question is getting at. What happens in 1763 again? That is going to precipitate this conflict. Treaty of Paris, right? And the Treaty of Paris, more precise than the Treaty of Paris, the French-Indian War, right? The war is going to end. there's a need to focus on the colonies, to enforce the imperial rule over its colonies, to generate income, right? And so what's important to understand here is that this is going to ensue conflict because the colonists, going back to the early 1600s, are accustomed to governing themselves. And they don't mind abiding by law. They don't mind paying taxes. These aren't anarchists. They understand the function of government in society, but what they also understand is part of that function of society, of government, is to have a government that represents the people it governs. And the only way to do that is to have elected officials who, people, if they are upset about policy, if they're upset about laws, if they're upset about taxes, they can redress those grievances, either by voting or protest, and the government might become responded to those grievances. And then this one right here, and this is real important to understand here. How does the concept of salutary neglect explain the origins of state rights? Let's, in the last 5-10 minutes here that we have with each other, we're going to get out a little bit early. Explain the origins of this. And again, what is states' rights? Does anyone have an idea of this concept of states' rights? What does that mean if somebody talks about states' rights today? What does it mean to, what does it mean for a state to have rights? Well, let's get a little bit more specific. The question is what do we mean by state rights? Let's get a little bit more specific, Valerie. The rights of power. What do we mean by state rights? And by state rights, I mean literally a state, right? Like the state of Texas, the state of California. What do we mean by that? Have you guys heard of that concept of state rights before? And how might have, what issues might have that be connected with? Decide, yes, but let's see. Give me an issue in which a state has a right to decide, and then and who, if a state is evoking its right, who is it evoking it against? Because usually what we're talking about here is a state having conflict with a certain institution. School funding, not necessarily, actually, school funding is not necessarily a state right, because that's actually even more local. Schools are funded either by municipalities, cities, or counties. So there we're talking about city rights. Right, death penalty, right? So yeah, some states have the death penalty. Some states choose not to enforce the death penalty. That's one of them. What's one law that's come up quite a bit in states that is definitely controversial? It's not a law that's been passed here in Texas. Abortion, right? That's gay marriage. Well, gay marriage is it doesn't really, that's federal law now because of the Supreme Court. So for a while there were some states that said that people could get married in their states. Like here in Texas, gay marriage, if you were gay, you couldn't get married up until the Supreme Court decided on it. And that gets at the heart of what we mean by states' rights. So a state right is in opposition to the federal government. There are certain rights that a state has that are reserved for the states. And so some of those things are the ability for the state to tax itself the way it wants to. So here in Texas, we don't have an income tax. In California, they do. We just have hold on a second. There we go. We have just basically the what you call sales tax to generate revenue in this state, and income and property tax. Basically, state rights are laws that are reserved, power that is reserved for the states that the federal government can't interfere with or shouldn't interfere with, theoretically. And if so, yeah, again, you could have the way people are taxed in a state. It used to be pretty much how voting was imposed in the states, and this would allow a lot of states during segregation to say that only white people could vote. It was a state right, and the federal government had nothing to do with how people voted within that state. One law is coming up quite a bit through a lot of states that is in opposition to the federal government. Hasn't passed here in Texas yet, but it's passed in quite a few other states. It's passed in California, in Oregon, Colorado was the first place it passed. Yes, weed, cannabis, marijuana. All right. So used to be that was illegal in all 50 states. It's actually still illegal in all 50 states because the federal government has deemed it to be a Schedule I drug. It is illegal. So all of the states that have passed it are essentially breaking the law, right? But they're evoking their right as a state to undermine the federal government's law. But the federal government does have the authority to send in the feds and to shut down all of the businesses that are selling cannabis and to arrest those that own those businesses and are purchasing product there. It probably won't happen, at least anytime soon. It would just be a political nightmare for whoever tried to enforce that, since the consumption of cannabis is so popular in those states. And more importantly than that, the revenue that is generated from taxing that is too important to the state. So it's not going to happen. But basically, a state right is these rights that are reserved for states, that they can pass their own laws. There is what's called the supremacy clause within the Constitution, and that's where we get into the problem of drug laws. And the supremacy clause says that any law that contradicts the federal government, the states have to abide. But as we see with drug laws, we're seeing some, at least political leeway, where states are able to get around this. So in this form, we have what is referred to as a federated government in our country, right? We have a country that is married, that is in union with a central government, the federal government, and the state governments. But the state governments still have a certain degree of autonomy, right? They there is a certain degree of not necessarily independence from the federal government, but autonomy from the federal government. And you'll see this term evoked, states' rights. And its roots are steeped deep in colonial history, coming from our favorite topic of the day, salutary neglect. And so what salutary neglect is going to establish is that you're going to have, by the time we get to the revolution, you've got these 13 colonies beginning in 1763 that are going to start to some degree to have a conflict with Great Britain that is only going to slowly escalate through the 1760s and through the 1770s, ultimately culminating to the Declaration of Independence and the war that would ensue because of that declaration. Essentially, what you had was 13 independent states that came together because they had a common enemy. Great Britain. And so when they win the war and are able to defend their independence from Great Britain, then they're going to come together as 13 independent states trying to figure out, well, how do we govern ourselves, right? And so we're going to get into the details of that in future units, but basically the first government that they form is founded with the first Constitution of the United States, called the Articles of Confederation, which tried to honor that phenomena of 13 independent states, which were going to be loosely confederated under this new thing called the United States of America, governed by the Articles of Confederation. That Articles of Confederation isn't going to govern very well because it has such a weak federal government, and it's ultimately going to lead to our present day Constitution in 1787 when it's drafted and ratified in 1789, the US Constitution. But nonetheless, that's important to understand because for the direction of this course, because where does this course end with? What big event does this course end in? By the time we get to the end of this course, what will we be studying? This course is a mini-mester, so by the time we get to mid-October, a month from now. No, not the whatever you're being tested with. What event, Carla? What historical event does this course end with? Or anybody? Well, if you guys don't know, let's take a look. If you guys don't know where you're going, let's make sure we know where we're going. Open up the syllabus. And we have a course description there. I wonder what it talks about. The course is a survey of the social, political, and economic, cultural, and intellectual history of the United States from pre-Columbia era to the Civil War. What is ultimately this course going to, what event is this course going to end with? Yes, the Civil War. Excellent, right? Now, what the Civil War entailed quite a bit, but at heart of what the Civil War was about was the power of the federal government. And so sometimes when you hear about people talking about the Civil War, especially people who are sympathetic to the Southern cause, as it's sometimes referred to, is this concept of states' rights. And so when the South secedes from the Union, what they're going to evoke is that the federal government has overstepped its original authority that was granted to them through the Constitution and has trampled on the rights of the states, right? Over the issue of what issue are these states worried about that they feel that their states' rights are being violated? Was it the issue for all of the states to grow broccoli if they wanted to grow broccoli? What issue? I don't think it was broccoli. What issue was it that they were most concerned about as far as what they thought as states, whether it was Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia? Slavery, right? So by the time we get to the end of this course, 1860, 1861, a guy named Abraham Lincoln is going to be elected. And he wasn't outright against slavery where it existed, but he was against its spreading, right? But for Southerners, the power of the federal government that it had developed from 1787, or 1789, when the Constitution is ratified, to 1860, not even 100 years, had become so great that even having a president in office who was at least trying to regulate the spread of slavery was seen to be such a threat that they envisioned that one day the federal government would probably outlaw slavery altogether. So essentially, you have people in state power in the South evoking their rights to own other people and believing in it so much that they were willing to secede from the country that they lived in and go to war with that country, which was the Civil War, right? So important concept to understand, getting back to salutary neglect, not just for the short term of understanding, well, what is salutary neglect, but of understanding the conflict and why the conflict ensued with Great Britain. So you have these, through the unintentional establishment of these colonies, with Great Britain not being a very strong government when it first started colonizing and not having the ability to govern its colonies effectively, the colonies were forced to govern themselves, right? The first example of this that we've already seen was the House of Burgesses, and then the Mayflower conflict, right? And again, we're seeing this. And so in 1763, with the French Indian War, and all of a sudden Great Britain, as the parents, beginning to want to parent their children, the colonies, in a very strict sense, you're going to have these colonists begin to say, what's going on? This is not the way it's supposed to work, or this is not the way it has worked. And so they are going to revolt against Great Britain. And again, from 1763 to 1776, we're going to see a series of kind of ebbs and flows of this conflict, and it's going to further escalate by the time we get into the 1770s and ultimately independence. But in 1763, if you were to ask any colonist living in any part of British America, do you foresee the colonies breaking free from Great Britain? The answer would have been no, of course not. I'm a proud British subject. I don't see any problem. And even through 1763 all the way to 1776, most colonists who were even revolting were not talking about independence. It's only towards the end when they realized that there just was no resolution in this. They had to basically break free from Great Britain and govern and do what they had been doing all along, which was govern themselves, right? And so getting to this quote right here, which you're going to see quite a bit in this lecture and the next lecture, The American Revolution. You've got John Adams, the second president of the United States, when he reflected on the American Revolution. This is what he had to say about it. But what do you mean by the American Revolution? Do we mean the American War, so the actual war to defend independence? The revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and the hearts of the people. So what he's talking about here is the effects of salutary neglect, going back to the early 1600s, before the war. This radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and the affections of the people was the real American Revolution. Right? So what he's saying here is it wasn't the war itself that was the revolution. It's what happened prior to the conflict between Great Britain and its colonies, going back to the early 1600s through the 1700s. That was the revolution of having a people develop in a continent far from the empire, developing the sense of independence that was the American Revolution. And the war itself was an event that defended that revolution, according to John Adams. He from his experience, the revolution was generations in the making, right? And again, salutary neglect is important to understand too, because it is something that is going to explain why something as from our understanding, and easily so, something as evil and disruptive to human flourishing as slavery is going to lead to a civil war, right? It's not slavery itself, although the people who are defending states' rights firmly believe in the institution of slavery and want to keep owning their slaves. But it is that concept of self-government that they're going to want to uphold, even as something as awful as slavery, as human bondage, right? The ability to govern in that way of self-government is basically what they're getting at here. And trying to keep government local, right? And so historically speaking, it's a mixed bag, this concept of trying to keep government local, because sometimes when government is local, if you have corrupt, twisted people in power, it's going to be very difficult to get out of that without having the power of a stronger government coming in to upend whatever corruption is going on. So like in the case of the civil rights movement, if it was just up to the state of Georgia or Texas, or Arkansas or Mississippi or Alabama, we still probably would have segregation there. It took a strong federal government to dismantle that. But on the other hand, though, theoretically, and in many cases, a localized government, like a state government or a city government, is a lot more responsive to your grievance that you might have, right? So, and just to give you a quick illustration of this, if you have a problem, let's say the city of McAllen all of a sudden is going to raise property taxes by 20%, where are you going to go to try to stop that? From where I'm at, I could actually almost see City Hall from here. I'm going to march down to City Hall and yell and scream at the mayor and ask him, what the heck is this all about, right? Now, if the federal government, if in Washington, D.C., they want to raise income taxes by 20%, I mean, I can call my representatives, I can call the senator, but they're not going to be as responsive. I can't really get in touch with them as far as seeing them in person, right? It's likely I might see the mayor here at HEB. Some of us might even go to church with the mayor, or even be his neighbor, right? And so you have a more proximity, more of a ability in a localized government to affect change, right? As you do in a far off government, right? And so this is the principle that developed during the colonial period under salutary neglect and became very important to Americans early on in its history, and still remains important, right? You still hear this, the overreach of the federal government. And depending on the issue that we're talking about, there's always nuance involved, but it's something that we that we still talk about and still have conversations and controversy over, whether some of the things that you guys have talked about, the death penalty, abortion, drug laws, marriage laws, voting rights, all of these kinds of things, right? And where that conversation is steeped in comes from the colonial history of this country that we're studying here. Anyway, I'm going to call it a night. If anyone has any questions, let me know before I sign off here. But if you want to do this assignment, available, let me go to, just to show you real quick. I'm going to go to week 3. You're going to go to salutary neglect. And it's at the bottom of that lecture right there. It's due September 10th at 5 p.m. So let me know if you have any questions about that assignment or any other questions about what was discussed tonight. And if not, I'm going to sign off for the night. All right. Thank you, Carla. And again, sorry about last night. Shouldn't happen again. But and if it does, I will do my best to get a hold of you before something like that happens. Take care, everybody.